Aliyah had always lived life on her terms. She believed herself to be a queen, even in childhood, and now, as a young woman, she ruled her world with an iron fist wrapped in designer gloves. Being the only daughter of Chief Alabi, one of the wealthiest men in town, she saw the world through the lenses of luxury and privilege. Her friends, who were all from elite families, admired her confidence, but beneath that confidence lay a contemptuous disregard for anyone she considered beneath her, especially the poor. Aliyah's pride was more than just an attitude, it was a lifestyle. It was a bright sunny morning and Aliyah was in her elements. She had just finished her morning skincare routine, meticulously applying her serums and creams, each one more expensive than the last. She stood in front of her full-length mirror and adjusted the silk blouse she wore, admiring the way the fabric clung just right. Satisfied with her reflection, she walked into the lobby where her best friend Ladi was waiting for her. Ladi was also the daughter of a wealthy family, and her presence in Aliyah's life was both influencing and validating. Together, they were an unstoppable duo and a picture-perfect image of wealth and superiority. Aliyah, I've been waiting for you forever. Please tell me you're finally getting rid of that awful car, Ladi said proudly. But Aliyah waved her hands dismissively. It is not the car, Ladi. It's the circumstances. I mean, who could have seen that pothole? Ladi laughed, even though she critically eyed the sleek but slightly scratched car parked outside. Pothole or not, darling, that scratch is an insult to both of us. We deserve better. Aliyah sighed, rolling her eyes. Believe me, I know, but until I get a replacement, I will just have to get a driver. My parents insist that it's for my safety. I honestly can't stand the thought of someone else behind the wheel. But then, desperate times calls for desperate measures. Ladi shook her head. Hiring a driver sounds like a nightmare. Can you imagine the types of people who we apply? Men with unpolished shoes, wrinkled shirts. Ew! Aliyah laughed. I know, right? It's almost amusing. They'll probably all be desperate, thinking they've hit the jackpot working for the Alabis. Just then, Madame Alabi, Aliyah's mother, walked in. She was an elegant woman, but she had a slight frown on her face as she approached her daughter. Aliyah, darling, you're not planning to treat those candidates poorly, are you? Madame Alabi's voice held a warning. It is important to remember that everyone deserves respect, no matter their background. Aliyah sighed, rolling her eyes in an exaggerated fashion. Mom, please. They are here to impress me, not the other way round. They should feel honored just to be considered. Madame Alabi's frown deepened. Respect is a two-way street, Aliyah. Just because they are interviewing for a job doesn't mean they are beneath you. How you treat people matters. But Aliyah waved off her mother's warning. Mom, I know what I'm doing. Don't worry about it. Her mother shook her head, clearly disappointed with Aliyah. As soon as Madame Alabi left, Ladi nudged Aliyah playfully. Aliyah, your mother needs to understand that you are just living up to your name. After all, Aliyah means high or exalted, doesn't it? Aliyah laughed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Exactly. And I have no intention of coming down from my pedestal anytime soon. The two friends laughed out loud, oblivious of the staff, who moved silently around them, cleaning, dusting, and maintaining the mansion that they saw only as the backdrop of their lives. On the day of the interview, the Alabi mansion was unusually busy that morning. A line of hopeful men, both young and old, some wearing dusty shoes, and others holding their hats nervously, stood outside the grand doors, feeling both excited and anxious. Inside, the Alabi living room had been transformed into a waiting area. Aliyah sat at the far end of the room, perched elegantly on a leather armchair that was far too grand to be called a chair. She tapped her manicured nails on the armrests as her eyes swept over the line of candidates with obvious contempt. A maid ushered in the first candidate. He was a man in his late 50s, with grey hair and rough hands that bore the signs of a life of labor. He held his cap tightly in his hands, looking up at Aliyah with a nervous smile. Aliyah did not even bother smiling back. She barely looked at him briefly, scanning his worn shoes and cheap, ill-fitting shirts. "So, Mr. Whatever your name is," she began coldly, "what makes you think you are suited to drive for the Alabi family?" The man cleared his throat nervously. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Mr. Ade, and I have been driving professionally for over 20 years. I am very familiar with the city, and I pride myself on being punctual and careful." Aliyah looked at him disgusted. 20 years, you say, and yet here you are, still desperate for work. Tell me, Mr. Ade, what exactly have you achieved in those 20 years? The man's face fell, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, Never mind," Aliyah interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "You are not what I am looking for. Next!" The maid ushered Mr. Ade out, and Aliyah didn't bother to look up as the next candidate entered. She continued the process, dismissing one man after another, with barely a glance. Each one left the room with embarrassment or frustration as their hopes were dashed by a few sharp words from Aliyah. Eventually, a younger man entered. He seemed more confident, though still a bit nervous, and he introduced himself as Tunde. He had a slight stammer and his hands trembled as he presented his references. "Ma'am, I have worked with several families," he said nervously. I am very punctual and I can drive long distances." Aliyah sighed, feigning boredom. "Do you even know how to drive a luxury car? You look like you'd be more comfortable behind the wheel of a bus." Tunde opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words seemed to escape him, and Aliyah didn't wait for an answer. "Next!" she called out in a commanding tone. One by one, the candidates filed in and out, none of them being able to withstand Aliyah's piercing gaze and rude questions. Her words were sharp, dismissive, and each man left feeling smaller than when he had entered. She was on the verge of giving up entirely when the maid announced the final candidate. Just then, a tall, composed man stepped into the room. He was younger than the others, probably in his late 20s, and he carried himself with an air of calm confidence that immediately set him apart. His clothes were simple but clean, his shirts neatly pressed, and his shoes polished brightly. He introduced himself with a slight bow and a respectful tone. "Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Aminu." Aliyah looked at him with mild interest, although her voice retained its usual tone of contempt. "Aminu, is it? And why exactly should I hire you?" Aminu looked at her in the eye confidently. "I have been driving for a few years now, ma'am. Mostly in Abuja, where I worked for a family, until I recently moved here to take care of some personal matters." Aliyah raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Abuja, huh? And I suppose you think that makes you qualified to drive for the Alabi family?" Aminu nodded calmly, undeterred by her tone. "I do, ma'am. I treat each job with respect." Aliyah let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Respect? That's a nice sentiment, but respect doesn't mean much if you can't do the job. Can you handle a luxury car, or will you get nervous behind the wheel?" Aminu didn't seem offended at all. "I have driven luxury cars before, ma'am. I fully understand the responsibility that comes with the position." She leaned back, briefly studying him with a look of mild disdain. There was something about his confidence that irritated her, as if he thought he could match her in stature just by standing there looking calm and unbothered. Anyway, she would put him in his place. "Fine," she said, sounding bored. "You are hired. Be here at 7 a.m. sharp tomorrow. And remember, I have zero tolerance for lateness. If you are late even once, you are out." Aminu nodded. "Understood, ma'am. I'll be here." He gave her a polite smile, and even though it was a small gesture, it irritated Aliyah the more, as if his confidence were a challenge to her authority. As he turned to leave, Ladi entered the room, catching sight of Aminu as he walked out. She looked back at Aliyah with an amused smile on his lips. "So, he's a lucky candidate?" Ladi asked. "He's too cute for a driver." Aliyah rolled her eyes, waving her friend off. "Please, Ladi, let's not romanticize the guy. He's here to drive, nothing more." Ladi laughed. "Aliyah, you are hopeless. Who knows? Maybe he will end up surprising you." Aliyah scoffed, picking her bag as they prepared to head out for lunch. "In your dreams, people like him can never." At exactly 6:55 a.m. the next morning, Aminu stood beside the Alabi family car. The car shone under the morning lights, looking freshly washed and polished. He was dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and trouser, with clean shoes. Despite the early hour, he was fully alert, ready to begin his new job with professionalism. The front doors of the mansion swung open at precisely 7 a.m. and Aliyah came out, walking elegantly in her designer heels. She wore a fitted cream-colored dress that hugged her figure perfectly, paired with a designer handbag and large sunglasses that covered half her face. As she walked, she held her head high, as if she were a queen about to address her subjects. Aminu opened the back door for her, bowing slightly. "Good morning, ma'am." Aliyah barely looked at him as she slid into the back seat with her gaze fixed on her phone. Without looking up, she muttered, "Drive. We are going to the nail salon on 5th Avenue. "Yes, ma'am," Aminu replied smoothly, closing the door gently and getting into the driver's seat. As he adjusted his seatbelt and started the engine, he looked at her briefly in the rearview mirror. Aliyah did not notice, as her attention was fully absorbed by her phone. They drove in silence and Aminu kept his focus on the road, but he couldn't help noticing the occasional scoff or chuckle from the back seat as Aliyah responded to messages on her phone. She seemed to be chatting with someone, and every now and then she would shake her head in amused disbelief. A few minutes into the drive, she finally looked up towards the rearview mirror. She caught Aminu's eyes and narrowed her own, as if daring him to say something. "What's your name again?" she said casually, pretending to not remember it from their brief interview the previous day. "Aminu, ma'am." "Aminu," she repeated, as if the name sounded foreign on her lips. "Tell me, Aminu, are you familiar with the roads here?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "I have spent a lot of time driving around the city. I know all the main routes, as well as the back roads if there is traffic." "Good," she said with a dismissive nod and looked back down at her phone. "Just don't make me late and don't speak until I ask you a question. I can't stand unnecessary chatter." "Yes, ma'am," he replied again respectfully. Aliyah's phone buzzed as she resumed typing furiously. It was her friend Ladi who chatted her. "How is the new driver? Are you regretting it already?" Ladi asked. Aliyah scoffed and typed back, "Oh, please. He's just as unremarkable as I expected. I can't wait to get rid of this whole driver nonsense." Ladi replied, "I can't imagine you having a driver. Do you even know how to sit in the back seat?" Aliyah laughed softly at her friend's joke, glancing briefly at Aminu in the rearview mirror, as if he were merely a piece of furniture. She typed back, "Barely. It's like being trapped in my own car, but whatever, this won't last long, that I am sure of." They arrived at the nail salon a few minutes later, and Aminu parked carefully, waiting for her to finish typing before he spoke. "We have arrived, ma'am." Aliyah raised an eyebrow, looking around with zero interest. "Obviously," she muttered, opening the door by herself. She turned and gave him a scrutinizing look. "Stay here and don't go wandering off. I don't want to waste my time looking for you when I am done." "Yes, ma'am," Aminu replied. Aliyah disappeared into the saloon without a backward glance, leaving Aminu sitting alone in the car. He sighed quietly, leaning back in his seat as he waited. He knew his job well, and he did not expect gratitude or kindness from her. He had met people like Aliyah before, people who saw the world as a hierarchy, with themselves firmly seated at the top. But there was something about her that intrigued him. He knew she was not totally a bad person. About an hour later, Aliyah returned. Her nails were now perfectly polished, and her mood had slightly improved. She entered the car and snapped her fingers impatiently. "Take me to the mall," she ordered. Aminu nodded and joined the traffic smoothly as they headed towards the mall. They drove in silence for a while until Aliyah's phone rang, and she answered it with a sharp, "Yes, what is it?" Her voice was loud enough for Aminu to hear every word. Whoever was on the other end seemed to have made a minor mistake, and Aliyah did not hesitate to make her displeasure known. "Who gave you the permission to call me directly?" she demanded condescendingly. "Next time, go through my assistants. I don't have time to deal with trivial matters." Aminu couldn't help but look at her in the rearview mirror. The way she spoke to people was harsh and dismissive, as if they were not humans. He had seen signs of it during the interview, but experiencing it now, he felt pity for anyone who had to interact with her on a regular basis, including himself. When she hung up, she caught his gaze in the mirror and frowned. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing, ma'am," Aminu replied, quickly shifting his gaze back to the road. She scoffed. "Keep your eyes on the road. I don't need a driver who is easily distracted." "Yes, ma'am." They arrived at the mall shortly afterward, and Aliyah directed him to drop her off at the entrance. As she got out, she turned to Aminu with a smirk. "Make yourself useful and wait here. I will call you when I'm done." "Yes, ma'am." As Aminu watched her leave, he felt amused and frustrated at the same time. It was clear that she had no respect for him, seeing him as nothing more than a tool for her convenience. But he reminded himself of his reasons for taking the job, knowing that patience was key. When she finally returned 2 hours later, she was with shopping bags, and she barely acknowledged him as he opened the trunk for her. She finally settled into the back seat, sighing dramatically, as if the mere act of shopping had exhausted her. As they drove back to the mansion, she turned her attention to her phone again and chatted Laddie. "This new driver is insufferably quiet. It is almost like he's judging me." Laddie replied immediately. "What do you expect? Those types think they are morally superior just because they have nothing to their name." Aliyah smirked, looking up at Aminu. "Exactly. As if I care what he thinks." Aminu remained silent, still focused on the road, but he had seen the look she had given him, and he was satisfied knowing that he had managed to make her feel uneasy, even if only slightly. When they arrived back at the mansion, he opened her door, waiting patiently as she gathered her bags. "Be here at 7 a.m. tomorrow, and don't be late. I have an early appointment," she said coldly. "Of course, ma'am." She didn't thank him, neither did she even look back as she walked up the stairs to the mansion. As he watched her leave, he smiled softly. Aliyah Alabi was a queen in her own mind, but like all royalty, she had her vulnerabilities. One bright afternoon, Aminu was driving Aliyah to one of her usual appointments when her phone rang, and she answered it with a huff, rolling her eyes as if merely picking up the call was a chore. Who is this? She snapped without greeting. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. But Aliyah's expression quickly darkened. And who gave you my number? She demanded sharply. Next time, don't call me directly. Go through my assistant if you have any respect for yourself. Aminu could hear her voice clearly. She wasn't making any effort to be quiet, as if she wanted everyone to know just how inconvenienced she was. The call continued, and Aliyah's tone grew more condescending by the second. Listen, don't waste my time. I am a very busy person, so make it quick. What do you want? Another pause, and then she gave a frustrated sigh. You know what? I don't have time for this nonsense. Figure it out yourself, she said dismissively, and ended the call with a sharp, rude tap on her screen. She muttered under her breath, clearly irritated. Aminu glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noticing her frown. He hesitated and wondered if he should remain silent, but something in him nudged him, a burning desire to speak up, to say something, despite knowing the risk. Ma'am, he began carefully. Please don't be offended, but the way you just spoke to that caller, it was a bit harsh. Aliyah's eyes snapped up and met his gaze in the rearview mirror with a look of cold disbelief. Excuse me? She demanded with a dangerously low tone. Aminu continued respectfully. I mean no disrespect, ma'am. It's just that sometimes a little kindness can go a long way. You never know who might be on the other end of the line. Aliyah's face hardened and her eyes narrowed. Are you seriously trying to lecture me? No, ma'am, Aminu replied. I just thought. You thought wrong, she interrupted. You are just an ordinary driver. Do I need to remind you of that? Aminu remained silent and his gaze focused on the road ahead. But his calmness seemed to infuriate Aliyah even more. Aliyah leaned forward, boiling with anger. Let me make one thing very clear, Aminu. You don't get to tell me how to behave. Your job is to drive, not to give advice, not even to make suggestion. Just drive. Aminu nodded calmly. Understood, ma'am. But Aliyah wasn't done. Her pride wouldn't let her leave it there. She leaned even closer and her voice dripped with venom. You know what? I don't need your pity, and I certainly don't need life lessons from someone like you. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped him sharply across the face. The sound echoed in the confined space of the car, loud and shocking. Aminu winced, but he did not retaliate. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself, and then resumed his focus on the road. For a few moments, there was a heavy silence between them. Aliyah sat back, breathing heavily as her chest rose and fell from the anger boiling within her. Meanwhile, Aminu kept his eyes on the road. He still felt the sting on his cheek, but he pushed the discomfort aside, focusing on his breathing to calm his emotions. He had been prepared for the hostility from Aliyah, but the slap had taken him by surprise. Still, he knew better than to respond with anger. He reminded himself of his purpose, of the patience he needed to maintain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aliyah broke the silence. Drop me off at the corner up ahead. Aminu nodded. Yes, ma'am. Aminu waited in the car while she went into the nearby boutique. At that moment, he felt both pity and disappointment. He had seen arrogance before and had met people who looked down on others because of their job. But there was something different about Aliyah, almost like she was controlled by an external force to behave that way. When Aliyah entered the boutique, she found herself alone in an aisle filled with designers' handbags. She let out a shaky breath as the memory of Aminu's calm face came flashing in her mind, and for a brief moment, she felt guilty. But she quickly brushed it off, reminding herself that she had every right to speak to him or treat him however she pleased. He was just a driver after all. But as she picked up a handbag to examine it, Aminu's words rang in her head. Sometimes a little kindness can go a long way. She frowned and quickly pushed the thoughts away. The following morning, Aliyah was already standing by the door of her mansion at 7 a.m. sharp, tapping her foot impatiently on the tiled wall. She glanced at her wristwatch and her anger rose as the seconds ticked by. 7:02 a.m. A frown creased her brow. Aminu was usually here by now, standing beside the car, ready and waiting with his usual calm expression. But today, there was no sign of him. Her fingers drummed against her phone case as each tap increased her annoyance. 7:05 a.m. Her impatience tipped into irritation. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number, holding it to her ear with a sharp sigh. It rang twice before he answered. "Good morning, ma'am," Aminu said faintly. "Where are you?" she demanded. "I have been waiting. You are late." There was a pause on the other end, and Aliyah could hear a faint rustling sound, as if he were moving slowly. "I apologize, ma'am," he replied. "I am not feeling well today. I won't be able to come." Aliyah clenched her teeth. Unbelievable. "Do whatever you want then. Just don't blame me for anything you see when you get back." She hung up abruptly and shoved her phone back into her bag angrily. Aliyah ended up calling a cab, but the experience was far from satisfying. The driver was clumsy and nearly ran into another car. He even took twice as long to navigate through the city's busy streets. By the end of her appointment, she was in an even worse mood. That evening, she vented her frustration to Ladi, who listened with a sympathetic ear as they sat in Aliyah's grand living room, sipping from delicate porcelain cups. "You are being far too lenient with him, Aliyah," Ladi said, shaking her head. "Honestly, if I were you, I would deduct his pay for every minute he wasn't there. You shouldn't tolerate disrespect from someone who works for you." Aliyah nodded. "You are right. I have been too forgiving. He should know better than to leave me stranded. It is very unprofessional." "Exactly," Ladi agreed. "Some people think they can get away with anything, but it is up to us to remind them of their place." The two friends laughed and shared stories of past employees who had dared to cross boundaries or failed to meet their expectations. And by the end of the evening, Aliyah regained her sense of authority back. But as the days went by, that sense of control began to fade. Aminu had not returned to work, and each morning without him seemed longer and more frustrating than the last. She found herself wondering where he was, what he was doing, and even though she would never admit it to herself, whether he was truly sick. The realization made her uncomfortable, and she tried to push it aside, focusing on her daily routines and her outings with Ladi. However, each time she glanced at her phone, she found herself expecting a message, a call, something that would explain his absence. But she got nothing, and it was not until after a full week that she saw him again. It was a bright Sunday morning, and Aliyah was preparing to leave the house to go meet up with some friends when she heard the faint hum of an engine outside. She glanced out through the window and froze in disbelief. There, in the driveway, was a sleek, luxurious car, a car that was far grander than anything she had ever expected to see in her household. And stepping out of the driver's seat was Aminu, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, looking as calm as ever. Aliyah's heart raced as she watched him step out, and she had a lot of questions in her mind. She composed herself and stormed out of the house. "What is this?" she demanded. "So you stayed away from work simply because you got another driving job? And why did you bring someone's car to my house?" Aminu looked at her calmly. "Good morning, ma'am." "Don't good morning me," she snapped. "You abandoned your job. I hope you don't expect me to pay you a dime." Aminu smiled softly. "You may do as you wish, ma'am. But there is something you should know." Aliyah scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, really? And what is that?" Aminu's expression shifted and became more serious. "I am not who you think I am, Miss Aliyah. I took this job to experience what people go through, especially those who are looked down on by others simply because they have less. My real name is Aminu Musa, and I am the owner of multiple businesses across the country." Aliyah felt her heart skip a beat. What? What are you talking about?" she stammered. Aminu looked at her frankly. "I am a businessman, ma'am. I wanted to experience life from a different perspective. I thought I could learn something from it, and I have." Aliyah's mouth was wide open as she struggled to process his words. She felt really ashamed. Before she could say anything, Aminu nodded to her. "You have a good day, ma'am." Without another word, he turned and walked back to the car. A man, dressed in an official driver's uniform, stepped out and opened the door for him, and Aminu got in without a second look at Aliyah. She watched the car disappear down the road, and her heart pounded as the reality of his words sank in. Aminu was not just a driver. He was a man of wealth and influence, one who had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay silent. The humiliation was overwhelming, and she felt a burning shame that twisted in her stomach. She slowly pulled out her phone and dialed Laddie's number with trembling fingers. "Laddie, you are not going to believe this." She relayed the story to Laddie, who snapped immediately. "Forget him, Aliyah. You didn't know who he was. And besides, he was the one pretending to be poor. He's the one at fault here, not you." Aliyah nodded, even though a small voice in her mind disagreed. Deep down, she knew the truth. Aminu's wealth did not matter. It was her own behavior, her arrogance that had been exposed. One evening, as she sat in her room, she scrolled through her phone, rereading the messages she had exchanged with Laddie about Aminu, cringing at the casual arrogance and condescension she had displayed. Each message felt like a slap in her face, a reminder of the person she had been and perhaps still was. Finally, she could not take it anymore. She knew what she had to do. She needed to speak to him, to find out why he had chosen to work for her, to endure her insults, and to hide his true identity. And even though she could hardly admit it to herself, she wanted to apologize. Without giving herself time to second guess, she dialed his number. "Hello?" Aminu's voice was calm as usual. "Aminu, it is Aliyah," she said softly. There was a brief pause. Then his voice came through. "Miss Alabi, what can I do for you?" She swallowed hard. I would like to see you, to talk, if you are willing." Another pause came, and this one was longer. Aliyah held her breath, wondering if he would refuse. But finally he replied, "Very well then, I'll send you my address. You can come by tomorrow." "Thank you," she murmured. She lowered her phone, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow, she would see him again, and somehow she would find the right words to explain herself. The next morning, Aliyah arrived at the address Aminu had sent her. She was dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, far from her usual designer attire. For the first time, she felt no desire to flaunt her wealth or status. She wanted to present herself as honestly as she could. As she approached the gates, she was amazed. The house was magnificent, twice the size of her family's mansion, and she felt stupid, realizing how much she had underestimated him. Aminu's driver greeted her at the entrance, escorting her through the large front doors and down a grand hallway lined with artwork and statues. She followed in silence as they approached a spacious living room where Aminu stood waiting. He was dressed in a casual but elegant outfit. "Aliyah," he greeted her calmly. She hesitated at the doorway, suddenly feeling foolish and small. "Aminu, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." He nodded, motioning for her to sit. She took a seat on the plush sofa and clasped her hands in her lap as she searched for the right words. "I wanted to apologize for everything, for how I treated you, how I spoke to you. I was cruel, and I'm sorry for that." Aminu looked at her but said nothing. "When you revealed who you really are, I felt humiliated, but it was more than that. I realized that the way I treated you wasn't just about you being a driver. It is how I see anyone who doesn't live like I do, and that is not right." Aminu nodded slowly. It takes a certain strength to admit that, Aliyah, and I appreciate your honesty." She looked up, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you pretend to be someone else? You could have been anywhere with anyone, yet you chose to work as a driver for me of all people." Aminu smiled faintly. "I have a passion for understanding people, especially those who are blinded by wealth or status. I wanted to see how I would be treated if I removed the privileges that come with my name, and you were a test." Aliyah was confused. "A test?" "Yes," he replied. "I wanted to see if you could look past what you believed defined a person. But I wasn't prepared for the person I found beneath that pride." Aliyah was embarrassed and lowered her eyes. "And what did you find?" Aminu smiled. "I found someone who was proud, yes, but also someone who was capable of change, someone who has the courage to question herself if she got rid of her external influences." She looked up surprised. "You think I am capable of change?" Aminu nodded. "I wouldn't have invited you if you were not." Aliyah felt a strange mixture of relief and deep respect for Aminu. Moving on, Aminu would send Aliyah gifts and flowers regularly, and she was confused about the gestures. When she told Ladi about it, Ladi was shocked and secretly jealous, and so she warned her, "Aliyah, you need to be careful with that man. If he could pretend about whom he was, then he can do anything, even worse. Don't you think he wants to harm you, maybe as a form of revenge for all you did to him?" Ladi warned, but Aliyah did not think so. "Come on, Ladi. Aminu is not like that. This man was as calm as anything all through the period of humiliation. He is a real gentleman, and I think I am beginning to feel something for him." Ladi eyed Aliyah, and the bile in her grew. She would never allow Aliyah to have such a man. Aliyah and Aminu started to meet for lunch once in a while, and just when Aminu was sure that Aliyah was fully down from her horses, he dropped the bomb. "Aliyah, I have a question for you." She nodded. "Okay." If you truly want to change and to see the world differently, are you willing to put in the efforts? Aliyah nodded. I think I am willing, but I don't know how. He looked at her thoughtfully. Maybe there is a way we can find out, Aliyah. I want to help you if you are truly willing to learn. Aliyah was curious. How? For the next 3 months, I would like you to work for me as a member of my household staff. You will learn to serve, to assist, and to understand what it means to see the world from another perspective. Aliyah's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. You want me to work as a servant? Yes, he replied calmly. It will be a proof of your willingness to change, and it will require humility, something you cannot learn in comfort. She felt her pride swell and her mind was racing with objections. But after a long moment, Aliyah nodded slowly. Okay, I will do it. Aminu smiled. Good. You will start tomorrow morning. Be at my house by 7 a.m. dressed appropriately for the work you will be doing. She sighed deeply. I understand. The next morning, Aliyah arrived at Aminu's mansion just before 7 a.m. She wore a simple blouse with loose jeans and simple flats. She had tied her hair back into a ponytail, feeling vulnerable without her usual armor of luxury. As she stood at the gates, she took a deep breath, reminding herself of why she was here. This was an opportunity to prove herself to Aminu, to her family, and most importantly to herself. The housekeeper greeted her at the door with a warm smile, which was a sharp contrast to the usual guarded looks Aliyah received from her household staff. Good morning, Miss Alabi. Let me show you around and explain what you'll be doing. Your main duties will be in the kitchen and around the dining area, the housekeeper explained as they entered a large, luxurious kitchen. You'll be assisting the chef with preparation, setting the table, and helping clear up after meals. It is not complicated, but it requires attention to detail and a good attitude. Aliyah knew what she meant, but she nodded. I understand. The chef, a middle-aged man, handed Aliyah a cotton board and a knife. Here, slice these tomatoes and onions. Be careful with the knife, please. Aliyah took the knife nervously. She had watched others slice vegetables before, but doing it herself was another matter entirely. She held the tomato awkwardly and the knife slipped slightly as she tried to slice it. The chef noticed her difficulty and assisted her, demonstrating to her how to cut it. Once the vegetables were prepared, the housekeeper led Aliyah to the dining room, where they began setting the table. Aliyah followed her instructions carefully, placing the plates, glasses, and silverware in the right position. As the day went on, Aliyah's duties continued. She assisted with lunch preparations, cleared the dishes from the table, and learned to sweep and dust the living area. More than once, she would turn around, expecting someone to step in and help her. But no one did. The day finally came to an end, and Aliyah left the mansion feeling exhausted but slightly fulfilled. She knew there was a long road ahead and that the journey would be tough. For the next few months, Aliyah's new routine became fixed. Every morning, she arrived at Aminu's mansion by 7 a.m. sharp, dressed in the same simple clothes, ready to take on tasks she once would have scoffed at. It was difficult at first, but slowly, she began to adjust and become more comfortable with the household task. She now understood what her own domestic staff went through each day, without getting any form of gratitude apart from a rude paycheck. One evening, as she finished her duties, Aliyah found herself lingering in the hallway outside Aminu's study. She had grown accustomed to his presence and his occasional check-ins, but today she felt a need to speak with him, to share the feelings that had been building within her. She knocked on his door and he let her in. "Aliyah, it's good to see you. How was your day?" "It was challenging but rewarding. I am learning more every day." He nodded approvingly. "I am glad to hear that." Aliyah was silent as she struggled to find the right words to express what she truly felt. Her hands twisted together nervously, and Aminu couldn't help but notice. "Is something on your mind?" he asked. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Aminu, there is something I need to tell you. I know I was difficult and I treated you and everyone else with disrespect. And I can't tell you how sorry I am for that. I admire you, Aminu, more than anyone I have ever met." Aminu was silent, allowing her to continue. "And it is more than just admiration," she added. I think I have feelings for you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unfiltered, and for a moment Aliyah feared for his reaction, afraid that he might see her words as a weakness or worse, pity her. "Aliyah," Aminu said calmly, "I am honored by your words, truly. It takes courage to open up your heart, but I need to know if these feelings come from a place of true understanding, or if they are simply the result of this new world you have been exposed to." Aliyah blinked. "What do you mean?" Aminu continued. "Falling for someone, especially when they represent something high, can sometimes be confusing. I just need to be sure that what you feel is real, and that it is a choice born from true connection and not just admiration." Aliyah paused. "Do you think I am confusing admiration with love?" Aminu shook his head. "Not at all. But love requires time and a foundation built on mutual understanding and shared values. It cannot be rushed." She nodded slowly, processing his words. "I understand, Aminu. I don't mean to rush anything. I just wanted you to know how I feel." "And I am grateful for that," Aminu replied. "I want us to start off as friends first, if that is something you are willing to accept." "Friends?" she repeated softly. "I think I can live with that." Aminu smiled. "Good. Let us take things one step at a time." Since Aliyah began her journey of humility and self-discovery in Aminu's home, she had distanced herself from many aspects of her old life, including her frequent outings with Ladi. She now spent more time with Aminu's staff, people who were far below her status, and surprisingly, she no longer found it irritating. Ladi, however, had noticed the distance and was getting frustrated. She could sense that something had changed in Aliyah, but whenever she tried to ask, Aliyah would brush off her questions with vague responses. Ladi's curiosity soon became suspicion, and when she learned from a mutual acquaintance that Aliyah had been spending her days at Aminu's mansion, her curiosity turned to jealousy. One afternoon, Ladi called Aliyah. "Aliyah, what have you been doing? You are always busy these days, and whenever I try to make plans, you are either unavailable or at Aminu's place. What's going on?" Aliyah hesitated. She knew that her friend would not understand the path she was on, but she also didn't want to lie. "It is complicated, Ladi. I am learning things, important things. Aminu has been helping me see things differently." Ladi scoffed and said sarcastically, "Oh, so now Aminu is your personal life coach? Since when did you need help seeing anything clearly?" Aliyah sighed. "It is not like that. I have been learning to see the world in a new way and to understand people better. Aminu has been a mentor to me." "Mentor?" Ladi asked sharply. "Aliyah, are you hearing yourself? Since when did you, of all people, need a mentor?" "I am just growing, Ladi. I want to become a better person." Ladi was silent for a moment, trying so hard to hide her jealousy. Oh, I see. So you are becoming a better person with Aminu's help. And what exactly does he get out of all this? Aliyah was taken aback by the accusation in Ladi's words. He doesn't get anything out of it, Ladi. He's just helping me because he believes in personal growth. Really? Ladi said coldly. Or maybe he's enjoying the attention from you. Men like him can pretend to be noble all they want, but at the end of the day, they still want the same thing. Aliyah protested. That is not true, Ladi. You don't know him. Ladi let out a bitter laugh. Oh, please, Aliyah. Don't be so naive. Men will always be men. Aliyah was disappointed in her friend. How come she had not seen this small-minded and envious part of Ladi? Aliyah said quietly, you don't understand what I have been going through. Aminu has really helped me. Ladi's voice turned cold. Fine, go ahead and change if that is what you want. Just don't come crying to me when he decides he's done with you. With that, she hung up, leaving Aliyah staring at her phone, feeling hurt. She knew Ladi's words came from a place of jealousy, and she wondered why. The next day, Ladi made a bold decision. Since Aliyah thought she was smart, she would go to Aminu herself and convince him that he needed a real woman, someone who understood the ways of their world, like her. Without informing Aliyah, she arrived at Aminu's mansion early in the morning. The staff let her in, and when Aminu saw her, he was curious. She was the least person he had expected to see. Ladi, to what do I owe the pleasure? Ladi flashed him a charming smile, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she stepped closer. I just thought I should drop by to check on you, she replied with a tender voice. It seems like you have been keeping Aliyah busy quite lately. Aminu raised an eyebrow, sensing her intentions. Aliyah has been working hard, yes. She's been committed to her personal growth. Ladi smirked. Oh, I am sure. But don't you think she's a bit naive? Aliyah has always had this habit of getting swept up in things. She doesn't always think clearly. Aminu's eyes narrowed. Aliyah is stronger than you give her credit for. Ladi took a step closer, lowering her voice to a passionate tone. Look, Aminu, Aliyah is sweet, but she's not like us. She's too soft for the kind of life you lead. If you want someone who truly understands your ambitions, someone who can stand by your side without all this emotional baggage, then you should consider someone else like me. Aminu cleared his throat. Ladi, I appreciate your concern, but I am grown to know what I want, and I don't need anyone to point that out for me. Aliyah is strong, and I admire her for that. Ladi's pride was wounded, and she warned Aminu. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Aliyah may be different now, but people don't really change. She will go back to being the person she was, mark my words. With that, she turned and stormed out. Later that evening, Aminu called Aliyah into his study. Aliyah, there is something you should know. He then told her about Ladi's visits and the things she had said in anger. Aliyah's heart sank. She had known Ladi was jealous, but she had not realized how deeply her friend's resentment had grown. Aminu reassured her, don't beat yourself up. People sometimes fear change in others because it forces them to confront their own flaws. But remember, Aliyah, this path is yours and you should no longer allow anyone influence you negatively. Aliyah nodded, but a wave of sadness lingered in her chest. Ladi had been her friend for years. They had shared countless memories, laughter and experiences, and yet it seemed that Ladi couldn't or wouldn't understand the person she was becoming. She looked up at Aminu. Thank you for telling me, Aminu. Now that I am here and know what I know now, there is no way I am going back to who I was. The following morning, as Aliyah prepared to head to Aminu's mansion, her mother knocked gently on her door, entering with a warm smile. "Aliyah, darling, may I come in?" Aliyah nodded. "Of course, Mom, come in." Her mother sat on the edge of her bed, looking at her with pride. "I have been noticing the changes in you, Aliyah. You seem different." Aliyah smiled. "Thank you, Mom. I've been trying to become more human, and Aminu has been of great help to me." Her mother smiled. "I am proud of you, darling. You are becoming the woman I always knew you could be." A few days later, Ladi, in a final attempt to assert her influence, appeared at Aliyah's family house. She waited for Aliyah in the garden with irritation written all over her face. When Aliyah came out, Ladi immediately gave her a piece of her mind. "Aliyah, this has gone on far too long. Aminu is leading you down a path that is beneath you. I am here to help you see reason. He is filling your head with nonsense, Aliyah. We are meant for a life of privilege, not this." But Aliyah faced Ladi squarely. "I understand if you can't accept my choices, Ladi, but I am no longer the person I was. And if that irritates you, then I believe you know what to do." Ladi shook her head. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when he dumps you." With that, Ladi turned and stormed out, leaving Aliyah standing alone in the garden. She knew she had lost a friend, but it was worth it. It had been 3 months since Aliyah first walked into Aminu's mansion with a heart full of pride and superiority. But within those months, a lot had changed. And then, one bright afternoon, the housekeeper came to meet her in the kitchen. "Aliyah, Aminu would like to see you in the garden." Aliyah's heart fluttered at the mention of his name, but she quickly pushed down the excitement, reminding herself that they had chosen to keep their relationship as friends. As she approached, he turned and smiled to her. "Aliyah, thank you for coming." "Of course," she smiled. "Is everything all right?" He nodded. "Everything is more than all right. In fact, there is something I would like to share with you." Aliyah's curiosity piqued and she listened to him. "Aliyah, I have watched you change over this past few months. I have seen you confront your fears, embrace humility, and open your heart to a new way of living. And I deeply admire that. You have shown me that people can change and that there is beauty in redemption." He reached into his pockets, pulling out a small velvet box. Aliyah's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. "Aminu," she whispered in wonder. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a single sparkling diamond. "Aliyah, I don't just admire you. I love you. I love the woman you have become and the kindness that now fills your heart. And if you are willing, I would be honored to walk this journey of life with you as your partner, your friend, and your husband." Tears filled Aliyah's eyes as her heart boiled with emotions. She had never imagined that this journey would lead her here, to a place of such love and connection. She nodded. "Yes, Aminu, I would be honored. I love you too, more than I can say." Aminu's face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He looked at her with joy. "I think your parents will be delighted." Aliyah laughed softly, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "Yes, I'm sure they will be. They've watched me change, and I know they hoped I would find someone who would see me for who I am and not just for who I used to be." He nodded and took her hands as they walked back towards the mansion together. That evening, Aliyah's parents arrived at Aminu's home. as he had invited them to a small, intimate celebration in honor of their engagement. Aliyah's father's eyes shone with pride as he embraced her, and her mother hugged her tightly too. "Aliyah, darling, I have no doubts that you and Aminu will build a beautiful life together." The evening was filled with laughter and love, and in that moment, Aliyah knew that she had truly found her way home. Thank you for watching. Kindly share your thoughts about the story with me in the comment section. What did you learn from the story? And also, what did you love about the story? Give the story a thumbs up also, and share with your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel if you've not done so by now. Until I bring another story your way. Bye!